The final sound was not a slam, but a click, a quiet, metallic finality that echoed louder in the cavern of her ribs than any shouted pronouncement. The heavy oak door of the Blackwood State Home for Foundlings and Wards settled into its frame, and with that precise, oiled motion, 17 years of institutional life were severed. Elara stood on the gray stone steps, a single worn canvas bag at her feet, feeling the afternoon sun on her face for the first time not as a ward, but as an untethered object in a world that had no designated place for her. The world felt vast, intimidating, and utterly indifferent. Behind her was the only life she had ever known, a life of schedules and shared spaces and the perpetual, low-grade ache of not belonging to anyone. Ahead of her lay nothing but the horizon, a smudge of charcoal clouds that promised a cold night. She was officially an adult, a designation that felt like a cruel joke, a label applied with the same bureaucratic detachment as the one on her file. Before the click of the door, there had been the rustle of paper. The home's administrator, a man whose face was a bland landscape of weary resignation, had slid a thin manila envelope across his polished desk. It was her final inheritance from the system that had raised her, a parting gift that was more of an administrative necessity than an act of benevolence. Inside, she found a stack of bills amounting to $112, a sum so meager it felt more like an insult than a lifeline. Alongside the money was a brittle, yellowed document folded into a tight square, a deed. The administrator had explained it with a sigh, as if recounting a piece of tired institutional folklore. It was a property left by a distant, forgotten relative, a great-grandfather she had never known, which had defaulted to the state's care along with her infant self decades ago. The property was in a remote northern territory, a place spoken of in whispers and warnings, and was considered, in his official terminology, unimproved and of negligible value. He called it her great-grandfather's folly. The final item in the envelope was a single, heavy key, its surface a topography of rust and pitting, its teeth worn and ancient. This, the man had said with a ghost of a smirk, was the key to her kingdom. He did not wish her luck. He simply stamped a final form, slid the envelope forward, and looked past her to the next piece of paperwork on his desk. The journey north was a descent into a colder, harsher reality. It began on a rattling bus that smelled of disinfectant and diesel fumes, its windows streaked with the grime of 100 forgotten towns. Through the glass, the world slowly bled its color, the lush greens of the southern farmlands giving way to the muted grays and browns of the high country. The passengers thinned with every stop, replaced by hard-faced men in flannel and worn-faced women with eyes that held the same bleakness as the landscape. After the bus could go no further, a mail truck, for a few of her precious dollars, took her another 50 miles along a cracked and frost-heaved road that wound ever upward. The final leg of the journey was on foot. The mail driver, a man who spoke in grunts, pointed up a barely-there track that disappeared into a stand of skeletal birch trees. The mountain, he gestured, was up there. He wished her more luck than the administrator had, which was to say he grunted a second time and drove away without looking back. As she began to walk, the air grew thin and sharp, each breath a small, cold pain in her lungs. The track was a treacherous thing of loose scree and slick, mossy stone, and the wind began to speak, a low, predatory moan that snaked through the pines and wrapped its icy fingers around her. When she finally saw it, the reality was so much worse than the administrator's dismissive words had prepared her for. The word property had conjured, in some desperate corner of her mind, a tiny, ramshackle cabin, perhaps, a hovel, a shed, anything with 4 walls and a roof. What stood before her was a ghost. It was the skeletal mockery of a house, a collapsed ruin of blackened timbers and fallen stone. A great stone chimney stack, listing at a drunken angle, rose from the rubble like a tombstone, a monument to a long-dead fire. The roof was gone, existing only as a scatter of rotted shingles and splintered beams across the foundation. The wind, no longer moaning but howling, ripped through the exposed skeleton, a constant, physical presence that seemed intent on scouring the very memory of shelter from the mountainside. To one side of the ruin, half obscured by a landslide of rock and earth, was a dark opening in the cliff face, a black wound that seemed to exhale a palpable cold, the entrance to an old, abandoned mine. This was not a home. It was a scar on the landscape, a place where something had died. For 3 days, despair was a physical weight, a shroud of cold that the thin blanket in her bag could not warm. She found the most sheltered part of the ruin, a corner where 2 low, crumbling walls still met, and huddled there. She managed a small, pathetic fire, feeding it with splinters of rotted wood she scavenged from the debris. It sputtered and smoked, offering a pittance of warmth that the wind immediately stole. The flames were a tiny, orange heart beating feebly against an overwhelming darkness, a perfect metaphor for her own flickering hope. Her small supply of food, a loaf of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a few apples, was dwindling at an alarming rate. She ate slowly, mechanically, the food tasteless in her mouth. The silence, when the wind paused its assault, was even more terrifying than the noise. It was a vast, empty silence that spoke of absolute isolation. The thought of surrender was a seductive whisper in her mind. She could walk back down the mountain. She could find a town, beg, become a ward of a different sort, a piece of human driftwood carried on the currents of charity and pity. The paralysis was complete. Her body felt as heavy and immovable as the fallen stones around her, her future a blank wall of impenetrable white. On the 4th day, something shifted. The change was not born of hope, but of its inverse. She was watching a tiny cluster of purple heather, a stubborn splash of life clinging to a crevice in a great gray stone, enduring the relentless wind that sought to tear it away. It bent, it trembled, but it did not break. It simply held on. Then, a wet nose nudged her cold hand. A dog, a scruffy, mud-caked creature with one floppy ear and ribs showing starkly through its matted fur, had appeared from the woods. It looked at her not with pity, but with a simple, straightforward expectation. It whined softly, a question in the sound. It, too, was an outcast, a survivor on the edge. In that moment, looking into the animal's trusting brown eyes, the sorrow that had frozen her limbs and spirit did not melt. It flash-boiled into a hot, clean, clarifying rage. A rage against the administrator's smirk, against the indifference of the bus driver, against the smug finality of the closing door. A rage against a world that would discard a person as easily as it would discard a broken tool. She would not lie down and die in this pile of rocks. She would not be a sad story whispered in some forgotten file. She would fight. The world had judged this place, and her, as worthless. She would prove it wrong. The first act of her new rebellion was mindless, brutal, physical labor. She would not think about the future, about the coming winter, about the impossibility of her situation. She would simply work. She would impose order on this small patch of chaos. Grabbing a fallen timber for leverage, she began to pry the smaller, manageable stones from the central heap of the collapse. Her muscles, soft from years of institutional inactivity, screamed in protest. Her hands, uncalloused, were quickly raw and bleeding. The pain was a welcome distraction, a sharp, clean feeling that eclipsed the dull ache of despair. She worked until sweat stung her eyes and her back felt as if it might split in two. She heaved rocks, sorted timbers, and cleared debris, creating a small, flat space in the center of the ruin. The dog, whom she had decided to call Cinder, sat and watched, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the dirt. He did not offer help, only a silent, constant companionship that felt more valuable than any spoken encouragement. The physical agony was a baptism. It burned away the paralysis and left behind a core of hardened resolve. Each stone she moved was a small victory, a testament to her refusal to surrender. Days turned into a week of grueling effort. The pile of rubble slowly diminished, sorted into neat stacks of usable stone and salvageable, less rotted timber. Her body transformed, the soft lines of adolescence hardening into the sinewy strength of a laborer. Her hands, though scarred, were now tough and calloused. As she worked near the base of the great stone chimney, her shovel struck something that was not rock or wood. It made a dull, metallic thud. Her heart hammered against her ribs. With renewed energy, she dug around the object, her hands clawing at the dirt and gravel. Slowly, she unearthed the corner of a heavy, iron-bound box, its surface pitted and scaled with rust. It was about the size of a large trunk, reinforced with thick metal straps, and it was incredibly heavy. It took her the better part of an hour, using a long timber as a lever to pry it from the grip of the earth. On its front was a large, ornate lock, so corroded it seemed fused shut. Her gaze fell upon the single, heavy key she had carried from Blackwood. It felt foolish, a wild and desperate hope, but her hands were trembling as she slid the key from her pocket. She scraped the rust and grime from the keyhole, inserted the key, and with a grating, agonizing shriek of metal on metal, turned it. The lock sprang open with a loud, resonant clang. With Cinder whining in anticipation at her side, she heaved the heavy lid open. The air that escaped smelled of old leather, dry paper, and something else, something faintly resinous and clean, like pine sap. The contents were perfectly preserved, sealed away from the damp and the ruin. On top lay a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a single, stylized letter. Beneath it, rolled and tied with twine, were dozens of vellum schematics, their surfaces covered in elegant, precise handwriting and intricate diagrams. She untied the brittle twine of the journal and opened it. The ink was faded but clear, the script a beautiful, angular hand. "My name is Ethelred," the first entry began. "And this place is not my folly, but my thesis," as she read. A story unfolded that was far grander than she could have imagined. Ethelred was not just her great-grandfather. He was a physicist and engineer, a visionary who had been ostracized by his academic peers for his unconventional theories on thermodynamics and geothermal energy. He had come to this mountain not to hide, but to build a working proof of his life's work. The journal and the schematics laid it all out with breathtaking clarity. This was not meant to be a conventional house. The ruin was merely the shell, the facade. The true genius was in what he called the Ethelberg system. It was a masterpiece of nature-integrated design. The core of the system was the massive stone chimney, which was not just a chimney but a high-mass masonry stove, a cachalophin of a radical design. It was engineered to burn a small amount of fuel at an incredibly high temperature for a short period, storing the immense heat in its tons of stone and soapstone mass. This stored energy would then radiate out slowly, providing a gentle, constant warmth for days. But that was only half of it. The true innovation was its connection to the adjacent mine. The mine shaft, Ethelred wrote, was not a liability but a stone lung. His diagrams showed a complex system of vents and channels carved into the ruin's foundation, designed to draw the deep, stable air from the mine, air that remained at a constant, cool but not freezing temperature year-round, and circulate it through the house in the summer for cooling, and, more importantly, to feed the masonry stove with stable, pre-warmed air in the winter, making its burn phenomenally efficient. The house was designed to be semi-subterranean, using the earth itself as insulation. It was a passive, self-regulating structure designed to work in harmony with the mountain, not in opposition to it. All washed over Elara, displacing the last vestiges of fear. This was not a ruin. It was a disassembled machine of genius. It was a legacy. The discovery of Ethelred's work gave her more than hope. It gave her a blueprint. Her plan shifted from simple survival to ambitious reconstruction. She was no longer just clearing debris. She was excavating a marvel of lost science. The journal became her Bible, the schematics her guide. She spent her evenings by the fire, Cinder's warm weight pressed against her, poring over the intricate diagrams, her mind, long starved for intellectual challenge, devouring the complex physics and engineering principles. The work was no longer mindless. Every stone she moved now had a purpose. She was not just building a shelter. She was resurrecting her great-grandfather's dream. The plan was audacious, a fortress of stone built into the mountainside, heated by a single, massive stone heart, breathing through the mountain itself. It was a design so contrary to the conventional wisdom of fighting the cold with ever larger fires that it felt like a secret form of magic. The coming winter was no longer just a threat, it was a deadline. Her remaining money was almost gone, and her larder was empty. The reconstruction required materials she could not scavenge: fire clay for the stove's core, lime for mortar, iron fittings for the vents shown in the schematics. With a list transcribed from Ethelred's journal, She and Cinder made the long trek down the mountain to the town of Stonefall. She walked into the town's general store, a gaunt, dirt-streaked figure with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that burned with a focused intensity that made people stare. She was no longer the lost, frightened girl who had walked up that mountain. She was a builder, a woman with a purpose as solid as the stone she now worked with every day. The town felt loud, fragile, and alien after the profound silence of her peak. The proprietor of the store was a man named Silas, an elder with a face like a topographical map of a hard life and hands stained with 100 different oils and powders. He looked at her list, then at her, his expression a mixture of pity and profound skepticism. He saw her request for fire clay, for cast iron dampers, for a specific grade of refractory cement. He saw the name on the deed she presented as a form of identification, the old Ethelred property. A gruff laugh escaped him. That place was a death trap, a pile of cursed rocks. He was about to send her away when a large, florid man in a clean woolen coat pushed his way to the counter. This was Councilman Barden, the loudest and most important voice in Stonefall. He snatched the list from Silas's hand and laughed, a booming, condescending sound that filled the store. A few bags of lime and some fancy clay? Planning on making pots while you freeze to death up there, girl? He dispensed his advice freely, telling her she needed a good iron stove, a cord of wood for every week of winter, and the sense to come down off that forsaken peak before the first snow. His words, intended to crush her, to expose her as a fool, had the opposite effect. They landed on her resolve like sparks on dry tinder, hardening it into something unbreakable. She met his mocking gaze without flinching, her silence a more powerful retort than any argument. The cost of the materials on her list was nearly double the $112 she had started with. Her shoulders slumped. For a moment, it seemed her grand plan would die here, on the dusty floor of this store, killed by a lack of funds. She was about to turn and leave when Silas cleared his throat. He had watched the entire exchange with Barden, his shrewd eyes missing nothing. He had seen the councilman's blustering arrogance, and, more importantly, he had seen the girl's silent, unyielding defiance. "That's a fool's gamble you're making up there, girl," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But I've seen men with 10 times your resources and a 10th of your grit fail." He looked at her calloused, scarred hands. "Grit's a currency, I understand." He took the list back from her and began to gather the items. He would extend her a line of credit. It was not charity, he made clear. It was a wager. A wager on her tenacity against the mountain, the winter, and the smug certainty of men like Barden. It was the first act of external validation she had received in her entire life, a grudging vote of confidence that felt more precious than gold. She left the store not with supplies, but with an arsenal. The weeks that followed were a blur of focused, feverish labor. Elara worked from the first light of dawn until her muscles gave out under the star-dusted canopy of the night sky. Cinder was her shadow, a silent partner in her Herculean task. With Silas's materials, she began the core of the project, the reconstruction of the Ethelberg system. Following Ethelred's diagrams, she mixed mortar and painstakingly reset the massive stones of the chimney, sealing each one with a precision born of desperate necessity. She delved into the cold darkness of the mine opening, clearing the rockfall from the vents her great-grandfather had carved, feeling the strange, still air of the deep earth on her skin. She rebuilt the firebox with the refractory cement and fire clay, a chamber designed for an inferno. She laid the foundation for the new walls, setting them deep into the earth, creating a semi-subterranean structure that hugged the mountain. It was back-breaking, soul-testing work, and she loved it. Every stone laid was a word in an argument against the world that had written her off. As autumn painted the mountainside in hues of fire and rust, news arrived in Stonefall, carried by trappers and traders from the far north. A winter was coming unlike any seen in a century. The old ones were calling it a wolf winter, a season of deep, relentless cold and blizzards that could bury a house in a single night. The news sent a current of panic through the town. Councilman Barden, never one to miss an opportunity for self-aggrandizement, took charge. His solution was simple, loud, and conventional. More firewood, more fuel, more supplies. He organized logging parties that worked day and night, stripping the lower slopes of the mountains bare. The sound of chainsaws and falling trees echoed up to Elara's peak, a frantic, desperate noise. The town scrambled, stockpiling vast mountains of cordwood, filling every shed and cellar. Barden stood in the town square, loudly proclaiming that Stonefall would fight the winter and win through brute force and an abundance of fuel. Their preparations were a frenzy of activity, a noisy war against the coming cold. Elara's preparations were a stark contrast. Her actions were calm, quiet, and methodical. While the town amassed a forest of cut logs, her own woodpile was shockingly, almost absurdly, small. It consisted of a few dozen carefully selected deadwood logs, all dense, dry hardwood, stacked neatly against the new stone wall of her shelter. She spent her time not on gathering fuel, but on the final, intricate details of the system. She sealed the last joint of the flue, tested the draft of the vents, and plastered the interior walls of her new, one-room fortress with a thick layer of insulating clay and lime. Her shelter was now a single, spacious chamber, half buried in the earth, with the massive stone chimney structure dominating one wall. It was more a stone cocoon than a house. Her final act of preparation was a ritual. On the day before the first flakes of snow were predicted to fall, she loaded the firebox with a third of her woodpile, opened all the drafts, and lit the fire. The stove roared to life, a contained cyclone of flame. For 4 hours, it burned with an intensity that made the stones of the chimney too hot to touch. Then, following Ethelred's precise instructions, she sealed the firebox, closed the flue, and shut the main intake damper from the mine. She had charged the system. Now, all there was to do was wait. The wolf winter did not arrive, it descended. It came in the night as a smothering blanket of white, the wind a shrieking banshee that clawed at every roof and window in Stonefall. The town hunkered down, confident in their preparations. In each home, iron stoves were stoked to a roaring red, devouring the stockpiled wood at an astonishing rate. For the first day, there was a sense of defiant coziness. But the iron stoves, for all their roaring, were ravenous and inefficient. They heated the air in the room, which was quickly chilled by the drafts that snaked through every crack, and most of their heat went straight up the chimney and was lost to the storm. The temperature outside plummeted to unprecedented lows, and the battle against the cold began in earnest. The frantic stockpiling, which had seemed so prudent, was proving to be a terrible miscalculation. In her stone shelter on Whisperwind Peak, there was no battle. There was only a profound and unwavering peace. The storm raged outside, a distant, irrelevant fury she could barely hear through the thick stone and earthen walls. There was no fire. The firebox was cold and sealed, yet the air within the shelter was filled with a deep, radiant warmth. The massive stone structure of the Cachalofen, having absorbed the ferocious heat of the 4-hour fire, was now slowly, gently releasing it into the room. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove, but a pervasive, bone-deep warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Cinder was not huddled by a hearth, but sprawled comfortably in the middle of the floor, fast asleep. Elara sat at a small table she had built, reading one of Ethelred's physics textbooks by the light of a single candle, a mug of herbal tea warming her hands. She was not surviving the storm. She was living within it, utterly untouched, in a bubble of quiet, miraculous warmth. Down in Stonefall, the second day of the storm brought fear. The wind was a physical force, piling snow into drifts that buried doors and windows. The temperature continued to drop. The roaring stoves now required constant feeding, and the immense wood piles were shrinking at a terrifying pace. The very act of fetching more wood from outside was a life-threatening ordeal. Barden's home, the largest in town, had the largest stove and the largest woodpile, and it was consuming fuel like a dragon. He paced his cold rooms, wrapped in furs, shouting at his family to stuff more logs into the fire, his confidence beginning to fray into angry bluster. The heat was concentrated in a small circle around the stove, while the corners of the rooms were already forming a skin of ice on the walls. The technology of brute force was failing. On the peak, Elara added a single log to her small woodpile, not to burn, but to replace the one she had used to cook her meal earlier. She had unsealed the firebox for a mere 15 minutes to heat a pot of stew, the brief flare-up barely registering against the immense thermal battery of the stone. The air remained constant, a perfect, stable warmth. She spent the day organizing her small space, mending her clothes, and tracing the elegant equations in her great-grandfather's journal. She felt a profound connection to him, a man who had faced the skepticism of his entire world to build this sanctuary. He had not fought the winter, he had understood it. He had used its own principles of energy and mass to create comfort. The silence in her shelter was the sound of his victory, a quiet hum of warmth that was the antithesis of the town's noisy, failing struggle. By the 5th day, the situation in Stonefall had become desperate. Woodpiles were exhausted. Kerosene for heaters had run out. The town was falling silent as families huddled together in single rooms, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the frigid air of their own homes. The power lines had snapped on the 2nd day, rendering electric heaters useless. The triumph of conventional wisdom had become a frozen tomb. Councilman Barden's grand stockpile was gone, his house as cold as any other. His authority had frozen and shattered along with the town's windows. There was only fear, the gnawing cold, and the bitter, silent recrimination of people who had followed a fool. They had waged a war on winter, and winter had won without ever acknowledging the fight. When the storm finally broke after 7 days, it revealed a world transformed. The sun rose on a landscape of impossible, brilliant white, a place of profound beauty and lethal cold. Elara pushed open her heavy door, a task that required considerable effort against the deep drift outside, and stepped into a world of muffled silence. The air was so cold it felt crystalline, a sharp intake that burned with its purity. Her shelter, a small, dark opening in a vast wall of snow, puffed a faint, warm haze from its single, unobtrusive vent pipe, the only sign of the life and warmth contained within. She stood for a long moment, breathing the clean, cold air, feeling the sun on her face, secure in the knowledge of the deep, abiding warmth at her back. Down in the valley, the survivors of Stonefall emerged from their icebox homes, exhausted, frost-nipped, and defeated. The town was a ruin of a different kind, devastated not by collapse but by the silent, invasive power of the cold. The mood was grim. Amidst the misery, a new narrative began to form, a question passed in hushed, fearful tones. What about the girl on the mountain? Barden, his face gaunt and his arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation, dismissed the question with a wave of his hand. She was gone, of course. A tragedy, but an inevitable one. No one could have survived that up there. But Silas, the storekeeper, was not so sure. He remembered the look in her eyes, the steel in her spine. He organized a party. It was not a rescue mission. It was a recovery mission. They would bring back her body for a proper burial. Barden, needing to reassert some semblance of his shattered authority, insisted on leading it. The trek up the mountain was an arduous, grim affair. The snow was waist-deep, the air mercilessly cold. It took them hours to cover the distance a healthy Elara had walked in a fraction of the time. As they approached the site of the ruin, they saw nothing but a great mound of snow, a featureless drift against the cliffside. Barden grunted, a sound of grim satisfaction. Just as he predicted, a tomb of snow. But then Silas, his old eyes sharp, pointed. High up on the mound, a small, dark pipe, barely visible, was venting a steady, shimmering plume of heat into the frigid air. And around the base of the mound, where a door should be, the snow was not pristine, it was disturbed, tracked. Someone had been outside. They trudged closer, their hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and disbelief. Barden, his face a mask of confusion, moved to the front and began to dig at the snow-covered entrance. He found the door and, with a heave of his shoulder, forced it open. A solid wall of warmth rolled out of the darkness, a physical wave of comfort so profound and unexpected that the men gasped. It was not the smoky, stifling heat of a wood stove, but a clean, gentle, radiant heat, like the air of a perfect summer evening. They peered into the dim interior. Their eyes, accustomed to the blinding white of the snow, slowly adjusted. They saw a figure sitting at a table, a book open in her lap. A scruffy dog lifted its head from the floor and issued a low growl. Elara looked up, her expression calm. her face healthy and untouched by the hardship they had all endured. She was wearing a simple woolen shirt, not the layers of furs and blankets the men were bundled in. The shelter was clean, orderly, and pervaded by an atmosphere of absolute peace and security. Barden stumbled forward, his face a canvas of utter disbelief. He looked around the room, at the massive, silent stone structure, at the impossibly small woodpile, at the girl who was not just alive but thriving. How? The word was a croak, a desperate plea for an explanation that could make sense of this impossibility. His entire worldview, built on the principles of brute force and loud confidence, had been shattered by this quiet, warm room. Elara closed her book. She did not gloat. She did not mock him as he had mocked her. She simply stood and walked them through the principles of her great-grandfather's design. She spoke of thermal mass, of superheated burns to store energy, of the stone lung of the mind that tempered the air. She spoke of working with the cold, not fighting it. Her explanation was simple, elegant, and delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had not merely read the theory, but had lived its truth. The other men listened with a growing sense of awe. They looked at Barden, whose face had collapsed into a mask of public humiliation, and then back at the girl who had done the impossible. In that moment, his authority evaporated, turning to dust in the impossible warmth of her shelter. He turned without another word and stumbled back out into the cold, his disgrace as total as it was public. He left Stonefall a week later, unable to bear the silent judgment in the eyes of the people he had so confidently led into disaster. Elara's status transformed overnight. The story of the warm shelter on the peaks spread like wildfire, a modern legend born from the heart of the Wolf Winter. She was no longer the strange outcast girl. She was a figure of awe, the woman who had tamed the mountain. People from Stonefall began to make the pilgrimage up the track, not to gawk, but to learn. They came with hats in hand, their faces etched with a newfound humility. They brought gifts of food, tools, and textiles, not as charity, but as offerings of respect. She did not turn them away. She welcomed them into her warm sanctuary, shared her tea, and patiently explained the principles Ethelred had laid down in his journal. She became a teacher, sharing the lost knowledge freely, her quiet voice carrying more weight than Barden's booming pronouncements ever had. Years passed. The landscape around Stonefall began to change. The frantic, clear-cut logging ceased. Instead, under Elara's guidance, the townspeople began to build anew. They constructed their own versions of the Ethelberg system, which they called Whisperwind Compacts in honor of her home. They learned the art of masonry, the science of thermal mass, and the patient rhythm of charging their homes with heat. The houses were different now, hunkered low to the ground, built of stone and earth, each with its own massive stone heart. Winter was no longer a season to be feared and fought, but a condition to be understood and lived with. The town became more resilient, more self-sufficient, and quieter, its people imbued with a patient competence that replaced the old, brittle bravado. Elara remained on her peak, her shelter now the center of a small, thriving community of apprentices and builders. She never married, never sought a title, but she became the unquestioned matriarch of the region, a living legend known simply as the Woman of the Mountain. Her hair grayed, and lines of wisdom creased the corners of her eyes, but the fire of resolve that had been kindled in her moment of despair never dimmed. She had arrived with nothing but a pittance of money, a rusted key, and a legacy deemed worthless. She had discovered that the greatest treasures are often hidden within the things a loud, arrogant world has chosen to discard. True strength, she had learned and now taught, was not found in the volume of one's voice or the size of one's fire. It was found in quiet resilience, in patient wisdom, and in the profound, unshakable understanding of the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Her life was a testament not to brute force, but to the elegant, enduring power of a better idea.